Dear viewers, it is time for a visit and I welcome you warmly and nice to have you back. Thank you at this point for your inquiries to Visite-QS24.tv. That was very interesting again, and I have chosen one that comes from Martin. Martin is 46 years old from Potsdam. Greetings to Potsdam, Sanktsosi. And you write, Martin, that you have different people in your own environment, partly in the mid-50s, who suffer from neurodegeneration. Neurodegeneration in the sense of Parkinson's, as you describe. A slightly younger friend even has an MS. She is only in her mid-30s and you ask how far these diseases are, which one should perhaps know much more about than up to the point at which they occur. And you ask what connection there is in terms of a cause diagnosis in the connection between the intestine and the brain. At the beginning, a short, small comment or observation from me. I think if you look at an intestine and see this crisscross of intestinal vessels, then it has a bit of an optical analogy to the morphology of the brain with its various crypts in the cerebral cortex. Just as the ears also have an outer contour, so does a kidney. And that's interesting to just observe. But today we are talking about two organs that exist in a direct reflectory context, and we also know that these diseases essentially find their origin in the intestine. This has nothing to do with neurodegeneration, but in general I don't know any tumor patients. I don't know any rheumatism patients. I don't know any patients with neurodegeneration who have an intact, strong, healthy intestine. And it's not that easy anymore if we only deal with the fact that, for example, 50,000 liters of fluid go through the intestine during a lifetime. That we now say 30,000 tons of food go through the intestine. What kind of power is that? What kind of performance does an organ system have that has to balance itself every day, no matter what we do, whether we do it consciously or unconsciously? And my observation is that we treat no one else as carelessly as we treat our intestines. Of course, all of this sounds a bit maybe only said at the moment, but I can't see anything here. I can't observe anything here, and everything that happens to me happens in secret. Billions of microorganisms are at home there, and when a child is born, it is almost uninhabited. That means, actually, the child gets it when it can still experience a natural birth. I emphasize that because it is no longer so natural nowadays. How quickly you can do a sectio, an imperial incision, it is not always medically really indicated. But the child that just takes a little bit of vaginal mucus from the mother, there the child gets contact with microorganisms from the mother's body. This intestinal flora, how it then builds up and settles, takes 3 years. Because here our microbial biome is determined, and the microbiome, as it is called, are very often also analogous to a family system. Because this is how you eat in this family, this is how you live in the family. And the possibilities that a child's intestine experiences are far from others in the tolerance for food like an adult. The adult human being has far more billions of microorganisms in itself as body cells. And these microorganisms, Enda Lane speaks of the enderbian, rattle and worry for us 24 hours. And these microorganisms also have a high ability to change. They can develop into bacteria, they can develop into fungi, they can develop back into so-called endorbients. This is the pleomorphism of Enda Lane. Of course, its environment is crucial for the intactness of our microenvironment. And no other environment is actually so early in a dramatic, also via the diet, misregulation initiated. I just think that alone the intestine, if you fold the intestine apart, then that's about 400 square meters of area. And this area, all these rattles that you take apart, this mucous membrane area, is the boundary between the outside and the inside. If you understand that the intestine and the mouth and intestinal and anal mucous membrane are a connection tube, open at the top and open at the bottom, then I would still call it an open system. But what is allowed to be absorbed into the body requires an intact logistics. And of course it is incredibly important that a balance is not disturbed. And balance means that the pH value in the stomach is 1 to 1.4. But that the pH value in the small intestine, because the small intestine decides what is now split and absorbed and what has to take the way back out via the big intestine. That is the task of the small intestine. We talk far too little about the small intestine, but in order for these digestive juices and enzymes to unfold, an intact milia and an intact pH milia are first and foremost important. These 8.5 are incredibly important. And in the end, a pH milia of 5.5 to 6.5 is required to regulate the big intestine, to push the peristaltic. And if a big intestine does not have this pH milia, then I cannot excrete the protein. For example, the final product of the protein is the ammonia. And ammonia is now absorbed and it passes over the mucous membrane and thus strains the liver. This knowledge of such a large, intact, and permanently important microbiome is crucial. And it really took an incredibly long time in medicine until you can only see how important it is today. And it is so important that we still think medically today if we do a colonoscopy and that would be enough. That is not enough. I have to make a good statement about this microbiome milieu. I can only do that through an analysis of the microbiome with all its good, less good, foliage bacteria, pH value, inflammation parameters, digestion deficits and all the rest. And then I can react and then I know where I am and then I can act. And then I can also make changes through certain things that I now know and stabilize this microbiome milieu or know the cause of an inflammation and thus influence the microbiome milieu. The intestine has such incredibly large information. It is sympathetic but also parasympathetic, as it is called. And 90% of all nerve information goes to the brain. And 10% also goes from the brain to the intestine or to the intestine. That means a child who consciously feels grief, sadness, pain, mental pain, reacts very quickly with his small intestine by having cramps, by being sad, and by of course taking care of this child as part of our care. The intestine is a large production site of serotonin. And serotonin, you all know that, serotonin is a happiness hormone. 90% of the intestinal bacteria, through the tryptophan, that is the so-called bacterium of the Bacillus infantis, there is serotonin formed through this metabolism through tryptophan. Serotonin is the precursor of melatonin, so I can sleep. The strongest anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, highly brain detoxifying. Melatonin is not only formed in the epiphysis, in the cerebral cortex, but originally the synthesis of serotonin from the intestine and dopamine. And with dopamine we connect Parkinson's. And dopamine is also our happiness and our addiction hormone. And dopamine is formed here at 50% in the intestine. It was interesting that in 1817, when Parkinson discovered, that was an English surgeon, James Parkinson, and according to him a so-called shake paralysis was even mentioned. He had already recognized or observed at the time that people, or that was a patient who suffered from an incredibly great restlessness and a paresthesia and insomnia in the hands and deafness, above all, and slight tremor, that he noticed when he examined him. That he had an incredibly inflated, but also firm, completely overwhelming and stagnating abdominal prefrontal lobe. And he did everything in 10 days to relieve this intestinal pain. That was interesting, because this person lost this symptom after 10 days of the most intense enemas. Wasn't Parkinson already on the right track back then? Why didn't you actually follow all of this any further? Today we know this through our research, through our science. But today we know, and we have to make it more and more clear, that we do not treat Parkinson with Marlapa, but that the impact on the dopamine change happens down here, on the tryptophan metabolism, on the chorianine metabolism, and thus on the effects, on the dopamine production. And that many things come together in a neurodegenerative suffering. But no way is it going to get past the fact that the intestine is regulating again. And I have been allowed to treat a man who is already in his mid-70s with a Parkinson's for a few years now, I think 3 years, 4 years. And it was a big way, it was not an easy way. Because you can imagine that this serotonin often lowers the psyche of such a person. You ask a lot of questions, you want to get to the goal faster, and so there is always an up and down. But I had such a wonderful conversation with him these days, and he said, my intestine is so much in balance, so reliable, like a biological clock, it is now regulating. That was a long way to get there, but I just want to say that you can never take the second step breath or the first in terms of medicine, and there are incredible conditions that give me a lot of satisfaction as a doctor of treatment that we have slowly brought something back there, which is the prerequisite for all further steps. And meanwhile, deglutitions also take place over many years in our body without us only feeling something on a symptomatic level. Especially here, everything is so dark and hidden. Of course, it takes the same time to go back this way, and for that it takes the same prerequisites that the big system, and the body, if it has 7 billion cells, it will never do it again to move back from its health condition or disease condition. How should he do that? He has to adapt to a situation. He had to make sure that he no longer gets these processes regulated alone, and that plays a big role. It plays a big role in what happens in the gut. That was the big impact on medication. How easily we still deal with antibiotic therapy today, which is aimed at life and primarily at life in the gut. And if it is diagnosed, there is no black and white. But then please make sure that what has side effects is immediately rebuilt in the long term and not simply left to the self-cycle and to think that everything will be able to find its way back. And on the other hand, a valuable system is quietly destabilizing. But that's not just the attack on the production of dopamine and serotonin. It is of course also that the gut develops a large biofilm, and that we are here, of course, also within the framework of our present time and our present burden that we have as humans. We see parasitic stress as a very causal deglutition in the gut. This is due to the fact that we are also able to travel the world. This is due to the fact that we are also very close to nature today, that we of course also play parasitic stress on each other, that we are also infected by toxoplasmosis. This is a topic that we have already discussed very often. And it always depends on the individual situation. How far can a parasite establish itself with us? How strong is its defense here? And it starts in the gut. I think these are very important questions that you have to ask at the moment, and to remove a biofilm. These are prerequisites. If you want to bring your gut back into health at all, then it is really not enough to only take pra and probiotics, but then it is very important to put a really huge value on a parasitic stress diagnosed, in order to then continue to deal with a fungus strain, a bacterial strain, a viral strain, and finally to get a viral strain under control again. This is important. That is why it is also so important that we know what our gut needs. The very first option is to make sure that we empty the gut once or twice on a regular basis. And between normal and not normal there are incredibly big differences. What is normal for one person twice a week has become normal for the other 3 or 4 times a day. Of course, there has also been a too big and strong excretion. And you simply shouldn't underestimate that diarrhea, in the truest sense, has a high loss of potassium and magnesium. But if the body lacks potassium and magnesium, then its cell membrane contact supply, its mitochondrial energy supply, its cell metabolism does not regulate, its detoxification will no longer work, its heart rhythm will no longer happen. That means the decisive minerals for cellular energy metabolism. Or if I have a loss of blood, women, 50% of the acid-base buffer is hemoglobin. If I have a low ferritin, it becomes clear that I can't produce enough red blood tomorrow. It is also very important for gut health to make sure that chronic, latent inflammation, perhaps also due to parasitic stress, does not cause to decrease ferritin. I don't think it's good at all to deal with a ferritin deficiency disorder by iron infusion. You have to get rid of the latent inflammation. You have to know why there is a constant ferritin deficiency here. This is very important, and it begins largely in our gut. It is of course clear that a vitamin D supply must be intact. People who have too little vitamin D have the most severe intestinal disorders. It's great to observe when you really do vitamin D again, dose it high and admit or make it clear that you don't always need a sunblock. And under no circumstances over 80% of the activity from cholesterol via UV light to boost vitamin D synthesis in the body that is not something that can be blocked by a sunblock. Because no calcium is absorbed. What's the point of taking calcium and vitamin D? If you can absorb the light in a Eve costume for 20 minutes a day, not just arms and head, then that's 10,000 units. And that's right. From the deepest earth, the system gives a power that hundreds of thousands of immune processes can now be regulated well. And of course I also speak in the context of good intestinal health and through a high-quality, nature-based diet. Far from any fast food. Far from any overconsumption of carbohydrates, sugar. Far from too much animal protein. Protein is very important, but protein can also be put together with high-quality things. And for example, pasture beef and the good organic egg and good fish. The dose is important. The balance is toxic. And we don't have to believe that the body doesn't find its balance again and again. It can do that. It has so many possibilities to find this good, great balance. There is an incredible order and discipline in our body. But we have to recognize that we can't always keep it in balance unconsciously, and I don't want to give any guilty indications, and on the other hand, of course, we should also consciously change things in our lives. And I'm so grateful for many questions from you, but maybe it's nice in the future that I can give you home recipes. What do I do when I have a headache? How do I react? Do I always have to give a headache pill? What do I do in the event of acute joint pain? Do I always have to take an ibuprofen? These are things that concern me a lot, and they will also be part of the program because I just noticed that the ease of doing all these things is a big problem for the intestine. And not for nothing do you always get a so-called stomach protection with 2 or 3 school medical drugs. It's a bit questionable to say stomach protection, and I get a Pantazole, a PPI blocker, which blocks my stomach acid. But what does the stomach do if it can't form stomach acid? Because that's the first antiparasitic protection for my organism and for the subsequent small intestine. And if you drive your stomach up to a basic milieu, everything will get through. That means this deep, acidic pH value is of incredible importance. Of course, not one too much, but what do I do if it's too much? What do I do when there's stress? What do I do when it hits my stomach? I think I should include these things in a program so that you have a little bit of a home pharmacy. What do children need? What do we need? And how can we help each other very well through some things? Yes, these are the things and everything that concerns movement. In the morning, really with the dry brush 10, 20, 30 times in the clockwise direction, do good to our intestines. And please don't forget to appreciate this intestine just as much. To be good to him. Also the language he chooses when it's out of balance. Either it's bloated and always, then when you eat fat and protein, you get hydrogen sulfide, ammonia. These are gases that sometimes form like a crash emptying. So much pressure is behind it. Think of the pancreas, and it's not enough to say my pancreas is weak or I have a weak liver. Do you always have in your mind that there are also parasitic problems that are very easy, that are all open corridors, that is a gastrointestinal tract that splits into hundreds of other small corridors? There is such an incredible range, and we had a show a few weeks ago about ropeworms. These are sometimes also hookworms that stick to the intestinal mucosa and not have the desire to leave their wonderful host alone. I hope I was able to open my eyes a bit. The topic of the intestine is my topic, and I just notice in everyday life, if I always prioritize it, no matter where people come from. Sometimes there is no need for more things because they all arise from a problem, and the same is true for all those who develop neurodegeneration in the context of a care for a tomorrow. I also mean dementia. I notice that many people are so afraid of dementia, but we have to take care of it, and we have to take care of it early. And that starts here, and I wish that every health insurance company would, instead of a colonoscopy, pay a microbiome examination for the insured. You know, there is so much valuable to be gained from it, and 3 times a year I then also ask that we maybe look now and right now. But the conditions are given that this intestinal mucosa is not in order. It is primarily inflamed. The patient does not notice anything yet, but something can develop, and on a healthy mucosa, I'm very sorry to say that, but nothing can develop on that is not good for the body, and that's why it's so important to look deeper. And we are in a laboratory technical position today to analyze incredibly large scientific references to biochemical processes. Not just about the stool, but also about the urine, in order to get clues about how far the microbiome has weakened here. And there is the development of MS, the development of Parkinson's, the development of dementia, but also the development of many, many other diseases that are now appearing on the physical level. always a cause, and the whole thing is of course still exacerbated by the leaky gut, that is, when the intestinal mucosa has become porous due to inflammation and the human being constantly gets toxins from the intestine, not only the good, also uncontrolled endotoxins. They call it lipopolysaccharides, the big word that hopefully tomorrow in the future every doctor will know. That this is an immune cascade on the physical level that of course can also increase the immune competence and capacity. And therefore intestine, the root of the plant human, and yes, I thank you, I mean you are 45 years old, it is incredibly nice that you are thinking about it today. And that things that may be normal for many people, of course, but give one another a push, and this show shouldn't do more. I should just maybe think about what I actually know about myself, and nowadays it is important, a lot stays with us, a lot of us have to be important to ourselves. It has not yet arrived how important these things would be to know for everyone from a medical point of view. That also takes years or decades, but I would be very happy if you are aware and if you decide for yourself and have a therapist and a doctor or a health practitioner who is very familiar with this topic. And then you can sleep peacefully. And then you can learn a lot. And then you can always steer the turns in a good direction much earlier and not risk the drama of metabolic side effects. The very quiet and in the hidden. The tree also has its roots deep in the earth, but if it is big and strong, then you can assume that there is also peace and quiet and strength in the depths. And yes, in this sense I say goodbye for today. I thank you very, very much for your attention, especially of course for your time, and I still have such a small thought from Mr. Cuppa on the way to himself. You are a lifetime every day to the new. And in the moment of unwanted happiness you have arrived. In this sense, a wonderful week for you, and I look forward to the next Visit show with you. And if you have any questions, just send them to visit@qs24.tv. All the best, goodbye.